Right. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I have to say I'm not actually from Cyprus myself. I don't have a massive amount of experience in the legal system in Cyprus, but I have given my expert witness testimony for this case, the Ayia Napa rape statements, and I will talk about this case here mostly. So I'll give you a brief overview of the facts, and I will mostly focus on my own analysis. So all of these events happened in July 2019 when a British woman was raped in Ayia Napa. Ayia Napa is a very popular holiday resort in Cyprus. And she was having a relationship, consensual relationship with an Israeli man. And during one night, which they were in their rooms, a group of friends of this man erupted in the room and started to have sex with this woman without her consent. So she managed to escape, and she went to the hospital first and then to the police, where she released a statement in which she detailed all of these facts. And what happened was that these 12 Israeli men were arrested. However, almost immediately after that, just a few days after that, the same Israeli men were released because this British woman released a second statement in which she said that these allegations were false, that because she 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 found out that some people were recording her, she was ashamed, and that's why she released this false statement. So these Israeli men were released, and instead she was arrested for public mischief. In other words, for making a false statement, false allegation of rape. Um, so, um, so what happened was that she couldn't leave the island for a while. She was in prison for a short period of time, and then there were some court proceedings that actually concerned these facts, and in which she was the defendant. So the trial was not about the Israeli man, who actually, by the time the woman was in prison, had already left, went back to Israel. But it was about whether she actually committed a criminal offense by making a false statement or not. And what happened was that during the trial, the woman actually said that, so her argument, so her version of the events was that this statement that she gave, the second statement, was not written by her. She was told what to write. Now, if all of this sounds familiar, this is because this is precisely how forensic linguistics was born. So the most famous cases of the very beginning of forensic linguistics, the Timothy Evans case and the Derek Bentley case, and probably most of you who are watching this talk know about these cases already. So both of them involve innocent people that were charged and convicted and actually killed for crimes that they didn't commit. In the Timothy Evans case, Jan Svartvik didn't actually provide evidence as an expert witness because he wrote about it years later after the event. But that's what gave the name to forensic linguistics in his monograph, A Case of Forensic Linguistics. In the Derek Bentley case, Malcolm Coulthard gave evidence, but that was again also several years later, but that led to a pardon. In any case, what all of these cases have in common with the Cyprus case is that there is a statement that is given to the police, and then after the facts, after the statement was given, then the defendant claims that they were coerced to write the statement in a certain way. Perhaps the only difference here is that in the Cyprus case, the statement is actually handwritten, and that is not challenged. In more specifically, I have to say that the part of the statement that was questioned is this short paragraph. So the statement, the disputed statement, had three parts, three distinct, very distinct paragraphs, and all of them were handwritten by the defendant. And actually, the prosecution admitted that they do not dispute that the first paragraph and the last paragraph were dictated to her. So these paragraphs were saying things like, what I'm saying below is the truth. I am fully aware that if I lie, then these are the consequences, and so on. So of course, these were dictated to her. But the defense and the prosecution disagree on what happened for the central paragraph. So the prosecution is saying that this central paragraph was handwritten by the defendant without any influence. So these are her own words, whereas the defense argues that this has been essentially dictated to the defendant. So she was forced to write these things to an extent that she was forced to write them also in using these words. So I'll give you just a few seconds to read the statements on your own. Okay, so in other words, what we have here, as I said before, is we have this question. This is the authorship of forensic questions. The defendant composed this paragraph in her own words, or was it dictated to her by a local police officer? And so we have two hypotheses. We have the hypothesis of the prosecution, which is that the disputed paragraph in its entirety was composed by the defendant in her own words, or the hypothesis of the defense. So all or some parts of the disputed paragraph were not composed by the defendant in her own words, but were dictated to her by someone who spoke English as a second language. Okay, so in my analysis, I noticed a set of features, and I then checked whether these features were consistent with one or the other hypothesis. So one of the things that was striking from the start, was very striking since the beginning when I read this report. The statement was the report I did and doing sexual intercourse. So both of them are instances of non-standard collocations. So these are collocation of do and report and do and sexual intercourse, and they are not standard collocations. Now, a collocation is a combination of two or more words that occur together more than what you would expect by chance. So, for example, we talk about strong tea, but we don't say powerful tea, even though we could, in the sense that you would be able to understand what I'm trying to say, but we just don't say it that way. So it's strong tea is a collocation. Or another one, another example would be we say big mistake, but we don't say large mistake. And what happens is that if you're not a native speaker of English and you are not familiar with standard collocations, it is very hard for you to know to know the way that a native speaker would combine words. And for this reason, evidence of finding non-standard collocations is highly indicative of a non-native speaker of, in this case, British English. But of course, that's not enough evidence, in the sense that we want to actually go and look at real data and see whether this is correct. And I looked at several different corpora. So what you see here are very large corpora like the JSI, which is more than 40 billion words, and 1015, which is about 20 billion words. But then also the BNC. These are web corpora, so of course you can't be sure about the data in there who wrote the data that you find in this corpora, but we have the BNC, where we know that the samples are from native speaker of British English, or BLARC, which is a British law report corpora, just to check for formality, whether there are formality differences. And what you see is that make a report is the predominantly the form here. So there is no formality effect. And of course, because the search here was not done using a syntactic parser, then there are all instances of do as an auxiliary that confound the results. But overall, you see that this confirms that the reports are made and not done. Even more strikingly is the evidence for doing sexual intercourse, where actually the verb that collocates sexual intercourse is have, and we can see that even including more corpora. So this is spoken, just the spoken BNC 14, so the latest version of the BNC. Globe, which contains several varieties of English, not just British. Now, which is another massive web corpus and core, similar, and then also American English with COCA. And in all of these versions, there are very few instances of doing sexual intercourse, and most of them are mistakes of the corpora anyway. And so the standard way of saying this is having sexual intercourse. So all of this, of course, is a strong evidence in favor of the defense hypothesis, because there's no logical explanation as to why a British teenager would use these forms in this text. But there are more linguistic features that I noticed. One of them was the construction was not the truth, and this construction goes in competition with was not true. Okay, so whether something is not the truth or not true. And if we look at corpus data again, what we see is that the standard way of realizing this meaning is to say that it's not true. So it's because it's unclear whether you choose the other one and for what, in what context. I would say that this is moderate evidence in favor of the defense hypothesis. Then another thing I noticed was the use of apartment. Of course, the spelling is not standard here with double P, but that's beside the point. I didn't look at spelling really. But the apartment as the option as opposed to flat. And this is because we know that the defendant is a native speaker of British English, and the standard unmarked form of realizing this meaning in British English is flat. So and we can find out, of course, in corpora. So what you see here is in red, you see the corpora with UK data. So, for example, N1010 just for UK data, BNC, Globe, only the UK section, and then same idea in blue for US data, American English. And what we see is that it is very unlikely for an American person to say flat. So you see the predominant variant in American English is apartment, but it's not as unlikely for a British person to say apartment, even though the predominant form is flat. But the evidence here is not very strong, so this is. But it's still something that is not consistent with the expectations in a way. So it's weak evidence in favor of the defense hypothesis. And finally, this is the feature that I believe is the most interesting. And it's a very intricate grammatical feature. So the statement says that I did not know they were recording and humiliating me that night. Um, I discovered them recording me doing sexual intercourse, and I felt embarrassed. So this is the crucial part of the statement, really, because that explains the reason why the first statement was made and it was not, it was a false allegation. Um, and there is something odd here, and it took a while for me to understand what was going on. But so what's happening here is about, has to do with discover and the complementation patterns. So discover is a verb that takes a complement clause, and there are different types of complement clauses in English. So a complement clause can be a that clause, or an in clause, or WH clause, or an infinitive clause. And what we see here is that we find that there is discover and there is an in clause that is its complement clause. So discovered them recording. Now, discover is a verb that overwhelmingly favors that clauses as complement clauses. So you discover that they were recording me would have been a more natural choice here. And so this is the grammar of English. So lots of verbs that take complement clauses, they have preferences for different complement clauses types. And if we can check that in corpora, and we can see, again, we can confirm that discover with a noun phrase and then ing as a complement is very infrequent, whereas discover and with a complement clause and as a that clause is predominantly what you see. You can see that it's not completely absurd in British English to use an in clause for discover, and this is because actually it has a specific function. So if we look at examples from the B&C, we see instances like she remembered wandering around the boyfriend's house, talking to herself, and then discovering him sitting in the lounge. So wandering around a boyfriend's house and then discovering him sitting in the lounge. Or I noticed the motion of her tail and turned to discover her stalking me. Or he was frightened to discover himself grasping his wrist. So what is happening in all of these examples is that the discovery is happening at the same time of the action being discovered. So in other words, the two events are happening on the same timeline. So if we want to draw a diagram, what is happening is that this is the recording, right? And then this is the discoverer, and the discovering act happens while the recording is happening. So in that case, it would be grammatical in English to use an in clause as the complement clause of discover. However, this is not what the statement is saying, because the statement clearly says that I did not know that they were recording me. So while the recording was happening, and so this discovery here is actually not happening at the same time as the actual events. So in other words, what the person who wrote this wanted to say was that they found out, so they discovered after the events, and in that case, the grammatical point, the grammatical version of this construction would include a that clause as a complement clause. And so all of this is, in my opinion, is strong evidence in favor of the defense hypothesis, because this is such a nuanced, complicated grammatical aspect of this text that it would be very unlikely to be faked if the defendant was actually pretending to be a non-native speaker of English. But also it's something that as a native speaker of English, it's something that you acquire and you're not fully aware of the way that you use grammar, of course, as we know that. So it's a feature that it would be unlikely to observe in a native speaker of English, but at the same time it would be unlikely to be faked if that person was pretending to not to be a native speaker of English. So I presented all of this evidence just as a conclusion. Then, if we just recap everything, so we have non-standard collocations, strong evidence in favor of the defense, B not the truth, moderate evidence, apartment weak evidence, and then discover strong evidence. So my conclusion was that the linguistic evidence strongly supports the defense hypothesis. So this is the evidence that I presented in court as an expert witness. It was an interesting experience for different reasons. I I had to have my evidence interpreted by an interpreter in Greek, and that was quite challenging, of course, because I had to speak very slowly, and I'm not even sure that all of the points that I wanted to convey actually came across. But interestingly, most of the people in the courtroom spoke English, so they could understand me. So it was the proceedings was carried out in Greek for legal requirements. And the other interesting part of this experience was that there was no jury. So everything was decided by the judge, and including whether the expert witness called by the defense was a reliable witness or not, which is actually was crucial in this case. And I was examined and cross-examined, so there was a cross-examination, and the questions I was asked were whether I was asked whether the defendant could have faked to be a non-native speaker of English, and my answer was that, especially the last feature, does not support that conclusion. And then I was asked whether I could have compared the statement to her own writings, to which my answer was that there was incompatibility in terms of registers and the text was too short. Anyway, so I gave my evidence, and what happened was that this evidence was rejected on the grounds that it was not reliable. And this was what happened to other experts who testified as well. So there was a psychologist who testified, and the same conclusion was reached. And so what happened in the end was that there was, so this trial, which was a trial within the trial, concluded that the evidence was to be admitted. So the statement was reliable and was actually written without any coercion. And then the final trial on whether this teenager was actually guilty of committing this offense was held in over several days until January of 2020. And there was a series of protests because several people believed and still believe that this was a miscarriage of justice. But eventually, in any case, the teenager was found guilty of this crime. And she didn't have to spend any time in jail, but she was allowed to go back home. And they are now, what her and her legal team are doing, they're challenging this to, first of all, the Cyprus Supreme Court, and if that fails, they will go to the European Union Supreme Court. And there is also a documentary that describes all of these events that aired in April. And perhaps you can still watch it if you want to know all of this, more about all of these events. That's all for me. So thank you very much for listening, and I will be happy to answer your questions.